I spent most of the day writing an article debunking J.F. Garrieppi's book, The Revolutionary Phenotype. And because I put in so much time into doing this, I think I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it in a droning voice because I don't know. It's going to be a long article, so this is going to be a long audio, and I'm tired, so I'm probably just going to read this in a very calm voice, and probably this won't be very good listening material I don't know. It might be interesting to listen to if you're interested in the ideas, but it could also just be something to put on in the background and fall asleep to. I don't know. We'll see. Okay, so that's enough of a preamble. Here we go. Debunking the Revolutionary Phenotype. This is a critical analysis of the ideas in the Revolutionary Phenotype by J.F. Garrieppi. All quotes are from his book, The Revolutionary Phenotype. Before I get into the details, here is the TLDR version. The book is a tangled mess of errors and nonsense. The book is based on the concept of a phenotypic revolution. This idea comes from a theory, which is not JF's, that DNA-based life evolved from RNA-based life. This is speculative, but plausible, and I think it's probably true. JF views the evolution of DNA-based life from RNA-based life as a phenotypic revolution, an event in which part of the phenotype, in this case DNA, became the genotype, and the former genotype, RNA, became part of the phenotype. He then extrapolates from this view to a dire warning that using technology to edit genes will lead to another phenotypic revolution, in which certain technologies that are currently part of the human extended phenotype will become the genotype, and human beings will become part of the phenotype of machines. JF describes the outcome of this revolution as a master-slave relationship. The machines will become our masters, and we will become their slaves. Before I get into why his ideas are wrong, I want to say a few words about JF's style. The prologue is full of exaggerated claims that border on the absurd. For example, you are indeed holding a book which portends the end of DNA-based life on Earth. Now, there is nothing wrong with making bold claims, and I make bold claims myself. But people who have carefully thought about their beliefs almost never present them in such a theatrical way, with all this hype. This book often reads like a parody of bad popular science writing and or bad science fiction. Okay, so the writing style is really full of hype. It's just way overdone. That's one of the problems. I guess that's a minor stylistic problem. There's a much bigger problem, at least to me, which is that JF uses highly metaphorical and anthropomorphic language to describe chemical and biological processes. This language is highly misleading and confusing. If it were just a way of communicating ideas, I would have no problem with it. There are good metaphors and bad metaphors. A metaphor such as climbing Mount Improbable, which is the title of a Richard Dawkins book, is a useful way of conveying an idea. So I think that's a good metaphor. But metaphors can be misleading. Metaphors have implications, and often those implications are tacit. They're hidden within the language of the metaphor itself, within the concepts that are used. And so they pass below the level of conscious scrutiny. And that's why bad metaphors are a major source of misconceptions. They kind of sneak errors into your thinking below the level of awareness. Some metaphors are misleading, and some are confusing. I'll give examples of each. E.O. Wilson's concept of social insects is an example of a misleading metaphor. The hives of bees and ants resemble human societies in certain ways, but there are important differences, which I've talked about before. And I have a link in the article to my blog post on bees, which is called "Bees Are Not Social." It is misleading to think about hives as societies, or societies as hives. However, it is easy to see the basis of the analogy. Both hives and societies are composed of many individuals living and working together. So it's easy to see why you might use the metaphor of a society to think about a hive, or the metaphor of a hive to think about a society, even though those things are actually very different. And that metaphor is misleading. It is misleading, but it is not really confusing. An example of a confusing metaphor is something like jeans print memes. That's not just misleading, it doesn't even make sense. There's no way to conceptualize the creation of culture or the generation of ideas or anything like that with the metaphor of printing, and especially with the idea of jeans printing memes. So with the hive to society metaphor, it's really easy to see the mapping. With this metaphor, jeans print memes, it just doesn't make any sense. As soon as you start to think about it, it just doesn't make sense. Okay, so that's the difference between confusing and misleading. And there are examples of both kinds of metaphors in this book. There are metaphors where you can see the analogy, but it's misleading. And there are metaphors where if you try to translate it into something that's descriptively accurate, you just can't even do it. It doesn't make any sense. I'll give some examples of JF's metaphorical language. Here's a passage from the prologue. The biological events described in this book are nothing short of apocalyptic. Imagine a group of living creatures who casually decide to fabricate another life form, only to realize, as they see their creation come alive, that it will eventually outperform them and ultimately take over. This passage seems to refer to the evolution of DNA as the medium of information storage and inheritance. Now let's unpack the language. Did an earlier form of life casually decide to fabricate DNA, or this new form of life with DNA in it? No, a new form of life evolved. It evolved from an earlier form of life by mutation and selection. So this kind of language is misleading, right? It anthropomorphizes evolution. Here's another passage that describes the same event. It is a fact that DNA-based life was created by another life form. The ancient life form was called RNA. Sometime after the creation of DNA, the RNA organisms lost control over it and could do nothing to stop its takeover. That is what happened here on Earth, and it can and likely will happen again. So, did RNA organisms lose control over DNA? No. We've already gone through that, I guess, but it's worth saying again. No, RNA did not create DNA. RNA did not lose control over DNA. The use of DNA as a storage medium evolved. In some organism, it arose as a mutation, or maybe there was a sequence of mutations that were selected for. Either way, in the organisms where it occurred, it helped those organisms to reproduce. And that's why it was selected for. So it took over in the sense that the organisms that contained this new chemical pathway were able to reproduce better than the organisms that didn't, and eventually they replaced them. And that's how evolution works, right? That's just evolution. All right, here's one more passage that it's very dramatic. Thus, we can now answer the question of the origin of life on Earth. The answer is quite simple but shocking. DNA-based life was created by another life form. It was somewhat of an accident. After the initial accident, DNA became so aggressive that it destroyed its creators by outcompeting them. It killed them, ate them, and gruesomely recycled them into building blocks that it then reused to produce its own organisms. We are the direct descendants of the DNA-based organisms that undertook this cannibalistic genocide. Pretty dramatic stuff, right? Well, this is what I mean when I say this reads like a parody of bad science writing, or maybe bad science fiction. This is a very misleading and confusing way to describe the evolution of a new form of life. He says it was somewhat of an accident. Well, of course it was. That's how evolution works. All forms of life arise by accident. They arise by mutations. He says DNA became so aggressive. Well, DNA is just a molecule that contains information. And it doesn't actually do anything, right? It has to be translated into other molecules by proteins. DNA is just a storage medium. So, what the metaphor is, I guess, trying to convey is that the new form of life with DNA as the storage medium was better at reproducing, right? All life is aggressive because all life has the capacity to reproduce to excess, and life forms compete for finite resources. So life is fundamentally aggressive. And DNA-based life is no more aggressive than RNA-based life was. It was probably just better at reproducing. That's why it's here, right? That's why it's still around 3.5 billion years after. And new forms of life usually replace their ancestral forms. Again, that's just evolution. Homo sapiens replaced Homo erectus. This is not some new kind of event. This is not some, something outside the scope of evolutionary theory. This is right inside the scope of evolutionary theory. A mutation occurs and is selected for because it helps an organism to reproduce. And that's all we're talking about. I mean, it's a very important step in the history of life, right? Because DNA is a very important part of life, but it was still just an instance of evolution, not something else. All right, so, I've gone over the metaphors. Some people were saying that I was just, quibbling, or I was just arguing about semantics, like arguing about the use of language. No, I'm arguing about the ideas. I disagree with the ideas in the book to the extent that you can actually extract ideas from the language. I also disagree with the language. But the language contains the ideas. The metaphors contain a lot of the ideas. So, this isn't just a disagreement over the way things are being communicated. This isn't a disagreement about style. This is a disagreement about biology, mainly about biology and about culture, and it's a disagreement about ideas. Okay, so I just want to make that clear. Okay, so I've listed a bunch of errors in the book, and I'm going to go through these. I wouldn't say that this is an exhaustive list. I actually crossed out a few because I didn't want to waste too much time. These ones I think are the main errors. And they correspond to the main ideas of the book. Because basically every idea in the book that JF presents is a misconception of some kind. All right, so here are the things I'm going to go through. The notion of phenotypic servitude. JF assumes, both explicitly and metaphorically, that the phenotype necessarily serves the genotype. This is a core idea in this book, and it is false. The next one is the idea of the phenotypic revolution, which is, I guess, the core idea of the book. JF proposes that this is a new kind of evolutionary process or event. It's something outside the scope of evolutionary theory. And I'm going to argue that no, it's just evolution. It's not some new thing. It's not some new concept. The next one is phenotypic forgetfulness. JF claims that the properties of the phenotype are not heritable. They are forgotten after reproduction, and that this is a problem that has to be solved for a new medium of inheritance, such as DNA, to evolve. And this is false. Mutations in the phenotype are not necessarily forgotten. So I'll explain why that's false. All right, the next one is replicators all the way down. JF believes that the properties of life extend all the way down to the quantum level. And of course, he seems to think that every step upward from, like quantum life is a phenotypic revolution. So he thinks this revolutionary idea, it is the explanation for life. Although there's no ultimate explanation because he has this infinite regress of replicators. That's why I call it replicators all the way down. And I think he uses that phrase in the book, actually. But I don't remember for sure. But, it's a play on turtles all the way down, right? Like there's that old idea that the world is on the back of a turtle. And then somebody says, what is the turtle standing on? And then the sage replies, oh, it's turtles all the way down. It's just a little joke about not solving an infinite regress. Anyway, so I think this idea of replicators all the way down is just silly. There's no reason to believe in it. And I think it comes from a lack of understanding of emergence. And specifically, not understanding how biology emerges out of chemistry. But there's a more general error that I see a lot of people making, which is they don't understand that one type of order can emerge out of another. They think they need to find that type of order at every level. So like you might have to try and find consciousness in the atom or something. Because otherwise, how could there be consciousness in a brain if there isn't consciousness all the way down? All right. Anyway, I'll get to that and I'll expand on that. The next one is the printer concept. You would think that the concept of a printer, the metaphor of a printer, would not be a big issue, but JF's concept of a printer makes no sense. It includes a very strange equivalence between mutation and control. So this is an example of a metaphor that is just confusing. It cannot be interpreted in any way. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. All right, the next one is the idea that only printer genes are selfish, in Dawkins' sense of the word selfish. But this is JF imposing a phenotype-genotype distinction within the genotype and saying that some genes are special and really they're the actual replicators and the other genes are just part of their phenotype. And this makes no sense, so I'll explain that. All right. The next one is that memetics is wrong. JF rejects the notion of memetics. He claims that memes cannot evolve to be parasitic on humans, that they must serve humans, they must be servile, and this is false. He also has a very confused idea of how culture and biology are related, so I'll go into that. He has this theory of how sex evolved. He calls it the phenotypic separation theory of sex. And I didn't read this very carefully because I was getting tired going through the book. But I noticed something that just didn't make sense to me, so I'm just going to mention it. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on this, but he describes the evolution of sex as a queen diploid cell producing haploid cells to be like workers or helpers or something. This just does not make any sense because for single-celled organisms, when they reproduce, they don't produce children. The parent cell splits into new cells. So the parent cell is destroyed by the act of reproduction. It is replaced by the child cells. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about producing haploid cells as helpers. So I don't know. Did I miss something in there? This one I'm not entirely sure about because I didn't really read it very carefully, so maybe I missed something. But anyway. All right. I should stop going into so much detail in these little blurbs. I'm going to get to the more detailed versions soon. Okay. The last thing here is the science fiction story at the end. There's not too much to say about it. I could go into detail and critique it, but I don't think it's worth doing because it's not a thought experiment. It's just a story, right? A thought experiment involves you state premises and then you derive conclusions from those premises. You imagine a certain scenario and then you draw out the logical or probable conclusions of that scenario. But that's not what he does here. He just makes it up as he goes along. And so this story has no value as a prediction, and it's not even valuable as an exploration of possibilities, because it's just, I don't know, it's just not a very good story. So I'll critique the science fiction story a little bit at the end. Okay, I gotta speed things up here. All right, phenotypic servitude. JF believes that the phenotype serves the genotype. This is a misconception. We often use phrases such as replicating your genes to mean reproduction. And this isn't entirely wrong. When you reproduce, you do replicate your genes. However, reproduction is not the same as replicating genes. And your form, the human body, has been shaped to reproduce, not just to replicate genes. Let's imagine some of the ways that you could replicate your genes without reproducing. You could generate spores that contain your genes and deposit them in the ground, or send them to the depths of the ocean so they would survive for millions of years. Right? If you were just interested in helping your genes to survive as long as possible, you could store them away somewhere. Or you could generate viruses that would contain your genes and infect other organisms with your genes so that other organisms would carry your genes, right? So there are a lot of other ways that you could replicate your genes besides reproducing, and yet we don't do any of those things. Instead, we reproduce. We create these bodies. We create new human beings, right? Why do we do that? Well, because we are human beings, right? And we come from a long line of people who reproduced the human form rather than putting their genes into spores or, into viruses or whatever. So that's why we couldn't evolve to do things like that, because those things wouldn't replicate the human form. So the human form can't evolve to just replicate genes. It can only evolve to replicate the human form. The phenotype is what reproduces. Reproduction creates new organisms, It creates new instances of the phenotype. It does not merely replicate genes. And it is the phenotype that has been selected by evolution to create new instances of the phenotype, new reproducing machines. Genes are very important. They are an important part of the phenotype because they carry very important information. But the phenotype does not serve the genes, even in a metaphorical sense. It does not exist to reproduce the genes. And reproduction is not just replicating your genes. Okay. JF believes that the phenotype serves the genes because mutations to the genes can be passed on, while mutations to the phenotype cannot be inherited. Now, I'm going to explain that this is not entirely true, but let's just assume that it's true, and it's mostly true. For human beings, it's almost 100% true. So let's just assume that, yes, the only mutations that can be inherited are mutations to the genotype. Does that mean that the phenotype must serve the genes? No, that doesn't follow, right? It just means that the medium of inheritance is the genes. So that's the way that information passes to the next generation, mainly, or at least that's the only thing that can be mutated, and that mutation will propagate, but that doesn't mean that the phenotype serves the genes. Okay, those two things are not logically related, right? And also, although, yes, mutation occurs in the genes, but selection occurs at the level of the phenotype, right? It is the phenotype that is selected to reproduce. The phenotype is what either reproduces or does not reproduce. So selection operates on the phenotype, right? Or through the phenotype. It's the traits of the phenotype that determine whether or not an organism reproduces, and thus whether a certain mutation is selected for or against. Okay. And of course, it is the phenotype that reproduces. And evolution involves all of those things. It involves reproduction, mutation, and selection. So there's no reason to put the genotype above the phenotype in some kind of hierarchy, or think about the phenotype as serving the genotype. That just doesn't make any sense. The genotype is part of the phenotype, and the phenotype has been selected to reproduce. All right, I know that's seems very abstract, and maybe it doesn't seem that important, but it's actually kind of important. All right, I'm going to get a glass of water and then come back. I'm falling asleep. Gotta wake up. Okay. Phenotypic revolution. A phenotypic revolution, according to JF, is when part of the phenotype becomes the genotype, and the former genotype becomes part of the new phenotype. The evolution of DNA-based life is an example. According to JF, DNA was part of the phenotype of some ancestral life form that used RNA as a storage medium and as the medium of inheritance. Then DNA became the medium of information storage and inheritance. Or in other words, it became the genetic medium. Replicating DNA then became the purpose of the organism, and RNA became just a means to that end. Okay, so that's the concept of a phenotypic revolution. So I'm going to explain why this concept is flawed. One reason is that it depends on the false notion of phenotypic servitude, which I've already explained. Another flaw is that it is presented as a new kind of evolutionary process, as something outside the scope of evolutionary theory, as an addendum to evolutionary theory. And this is false. It is just evolution. The reason why JF thinks this is special is because he thinks of the genes as the purpose of the organism. And that's why he views the evolution of a new genetic medium as something outside evolutionary theory. because he thinks that evolutionary theory is about the genes, right? And he thinks this violates the principle of the selfish gene or whatever, because now this evolutionary step did not improve the fitness of the RNA genes. However, like, even if you think about it that way, it did probably improve the fitness of the genes if you think about them as information, because now the information is stored in a better medium. And after all, it's information that replicates. It's not the medium that replicates. So, like, the whole thing to me is just based on misleading metaphors. Based on misconceptions about evolution, and based on these confusing ways of thinking about, purpose. The purpose of life, I guess. And he uses very misleading language to talk about this. He talks about RNA and DNA as if they have some interest in being the genetic medium. Like as if DNA won and RNA lost, because DNA is now the genetic medium of life. Well, with a few things you could call exceptions, but whatever. But DNA is just a type of molecule. It's just a structure of atoms that has no interests. DNA and RNA did not evolve. They're just types of molecules. The information in them evolved, and the phenotype of a cell or of any organism evolved. But DNA and RNA did not evolve. They're just types of molecules. So I think, this whole notion is based on misleading metaphors and confusing language. And it's just describing evolution. One evolutionary event that occurred 3.5 billion years ago. Right? Okay. Phenotypic forgetfulness. JF claims that the phenotype is forgetful, in that mutations to the phenotype are not heritable. For example, if you lose your hand in a car accident, you do not pass on one-handedness to your children. They will inherit two-handedness from your genes and the genes of your mate, right? And this is almost entirely true for complex multicellular life, that the phenotype is forgetful, that almost anything that happens to the phenotype is not inherited by offspring. And it is mostly true for single-celled organisms that exist today. However, it is not necessarily true, and it was not true for the early form of life in which DNA first emerged. The distinction between genotype and phenotype is less meaningful for single-celled organisms than it is for multicellular life, right? Because for a human, the phenotype is the body, and the genotype is the genes. For a single-celled organism, such as a bacterium, the phenotype is the cell, and the genotype is the genes. And, you'll see why the distinction becomes a little bit less important there. When a cell reproduces by mitosis, so when it splits into two cells, each of those new cells contains all of the necessary molecules for the cell's internal processes. Both of those daughter cells contain the DNA of the parent cell and also all of the proteins and other chemicals that are in that cell. So the daughter cells do not just inherit DNA from the parent, they inherit all of their molecules, right? Now, this is true for a human as well, that you inherit more than just DNA from your parents. You inherit a cell, right? Mostly from your mother. You inherit the egg. And the egg is a big cell with a lot of stuff in it besides DNA. But because you grow from that cell by a cell division, and because of the way that protein synthesis works, it's very unlikely that any changes to, any mutations even to that cell, unless they destroy it, are really going to affect your body. So like a mutation to a protein in that cell is probably not going to have much of an effect, because proteins are assembled from RNA templates, which are in turn assembled from DNA templates, and so a mutation to a protein is not going to replicate, because proteins don't replicate themselves. There are exceptions. There are prions, these little proteins that actually do replicate, and they cause certain diseases, like Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. But anyway, that's a rare exception. So basically, yeah, because DNA is the medium of inheritance, mutations to DNA are the main way that new information can be introduced into a life form. However, if you think back to this early ancestral RNA-based life form, let's say that some new chemical pathway emerged, a cycle of DNA that was replicating DNA, some kind of cycle in which proteins would generate DNA from DNA. Like once you have that cycle, it's going to get passed on to the daughter cells as part of the phenotype, because it's the phenotype that replicates the whole phenotype. So there's no problem of phenotypic forgetfulness in this early life form. And even today, if a new circular pathway happened to emerge in some cell, it could be passed on to daughter cells. And, you could get the emergence of a new medium of inheritance. There's nothing that prevents that. There's no law of nature that prevents it. It's just very unlikely, because if it hasn't happened in the last 3.5 billion years or so, it's not very likely to happen now, right? And that's probably because DNA is a good storage medium, and there are no better alternatives that might arise by mutation. So we're probably just, stuck with DNA the way it is. But not because the phenotype is necessarily forgetful. All right, that was probably unnecessarily verbose. Okay, replicators all the way down. JF seems to believe that the biological processes of reproduction and evolution exist at layers below that of the cell, in chemistry, and even at the quantum level. He presents this as if it were a profound insight, rather than an intellectual cop-out. Now, I think this is a fairly common mistake, to overextend concepts. Like little kids will, they'll learn the word dog and then they'll call every animal a dog, right? There's that old joke that to someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And this is often true of scientists. To a biologist, everything looks like biology. But this approach, this attempt to, shoehorn all the order of existence into your existing conceptual framework, your special conceptual framework of your field of knowledge, it generally fails because there are many different layers of order in the universe, and they require different conceptual frameworks. They require different concepts and theories. Psychology requires different concepts than biology. Biology requires different concepts than physics, right? So in biology, you have forms that have functions. Like you could talk about the function of a hand or a fin or something like that. That doesn't really exist in physics. Metaphors from one level can sometimes be useful in understanding things at another level, and also for bringing out common patterns, like feedback loops. So even though there are these different layers of order, they have some things in common. But it's usually a mistake to, try to project the type of order that exists at one level down to the level below. Or go the opposite direction and project it upwards. And this is an example of that. It is a mistake to push the replicator concept below the level of biology. The place where it emerges is really the cell. And it emerges out of a feedback loop. The feedback loop is autocatalysis. Life begins as an autocatalytic set of molecules. A set of molecules that, as a set, can catalyze all the molecules in the set. So every molecule in the set can be catalyzed by some combination of the other molecules in the set. Okay, and so for example, with RNA, DNA, and proteins, you can catalyze DNA from DNA and proteins. You can catalyze RNA from DNA and proteins. And you can catalyze proteins from RNA and proteins. Right? So the combination of DNA, RNA, and proteins can catalyze DNA, RNA, and proteins if you have the right proteins and the right nucleotide sequences in DNA. And that's an autocatalytic set, right? Because all the molecules in the set together can catalyze all the molecules in the set. And once that emerges, if it can get energy from the environment, like if it has metabolism, because you need that as well, then it's capable of reproducing because you can catalyze all the molecules in the set, so you can create many, many copies of all of these molecules. Then you can split the cell into two, and each one will still contain an autocatalytic set. Okay, so that's how biology emerges out of chemistry. But if you don't understand that, then you might be tempted to project the properties of life all the way down. But that's a mistake. All right, I don't want to go on too much about that. The next thing is the printer concept. This is a really confusing idea. The printer concept is, I think, the most confusing idea in the book. Now, there's nothing wrong with thinking of the protein complexes that assemble DNA, RNA, and proteins as printers. It is a useful descriptive metaphor. All three types of molecules are sequences of simpler molecules that are assembled by protein complexes. So basically, as I was saying before, RNA, DNA, and proteins are all put together by proteins, and they're assembled by basically putting simpler molecules together in a sequence. Okay, so there is a useful analogy between the way that molecules are assembled and language. And also printing could be a useful metaphor, because in the synthesis of DNA, RNA, and proteins, in all of those processes, you're just copying information from one molecule to another, right? So you copy information from DNA to RNA, you copy information from RNA to proteins. Okay, it is a copying operation. So the concept of a printer is a pretty good metaphor for that process. There's nothing wrong with that. But JF adds some very strange properties to the concept of a printer. And these are properties that printers don't have. He almost attributes consciousness to the printer. He kind of pushes some psychological properties into the printer. So I'll read two passages from his definition of a printer. Specifically, the term printer includes any entity that controls the content of the replicator, but not those that merely select replicators. The term printer is limited to those entities that have access to determining the content of the replication through mutations. Okay, so he says the printer includes any entity that controls the content of the replicator. So, in this case, the replicator might be a DNA strand. And the printer includes anything that controls the content of the DNA strand. But what does this notion of control mean? The term control is a psychological term. It refers to a causal relationship between the will of a subject and some outcome. So, for example, I control my car because I can choose to turn it to the left or the right. And by, moving the steering wheel to the left or the right, I can make the car go to the left or the right. So I have control over my car. Okay, that's what control means. That there's a causal relationship from my will to the outcome. What would control mean for a printer, like for a complex of proteins that assembles a DNA molecule? What would it mean? It doesn't really make sense to say that a printer has control over what it prints, right? Even like just a real printer, like, I don't know, like a laser printer. A laser printer doesn't write your essay for you, right? It just copies information from your computer to paper, right? Okay, so that doesn't really make sense. And then he uses the phrase determining the content of the of the replication through mutations. Determining the content of the replication through mutations. What does that mean? It just doesn't make any sense. Mutations, by definition, are random. You don't determine something through mutations, right? That just does not make any sense. So this definition doesn't make any sense. He seems to be conflating control with copying, and also determinism with mutation. And because that makes no sense, anything that follows from this definition, any use of this term, doesn't make any sense because it contains these fundamental confusions. He also seems to believe, and this is where it just goes, like, for me, this is just batshit crazy. Like, this is just like way the fuck out in left field. He seems to believe that printer genes, like the genes that determine the form of the printer, will be selected to print the right mutations. So, like, this just doesn't make any sense, because what makes a mutation good is just selection, right? That after the fact it is selected. That's the only way you know if a mutation is good, that after the fact it is selected. It makes the organism reproduce, so it's selected. There's no way for a printer to know what mutations to generate, right? Even if that's something a printer did. There's no way for it to know, oh, I need to insert this codon instead of that codon, so I get a different amino acid here, or whatever. It just doesn't make any sense. It's like he's attributing foresight to the printer or something. Or that it will evolve to somehow know when to mutate something. And this is just crazy. I don't know if I should bother trying to make sense out of it. I could say, well, okay, yes, you can imagine a scenario where the printer evolves to print the right mutations, but it would still have to, the printer would then have to mutate, or the printer genes would have to mutate, and those mutations would have to be selected by natural selection for their effects on the printing process. And so all that would do would be to just move evolution from the genetic medium in its entirety to some subset of the genetic medium, making it slower, right? And just slower and much less effective. So it just does not make any sense. It wouldn't fundamentally change evolution. It wouldn't make the printer conscious or have any control or foresight or anything like that. So I don't even know what the hell this means. It's just nonsense. I mean, I could try to reverse engineer JF's thinking, but I just think he's confused. Another thing he does is he applies the notion of a printer to the human brain and also to the relationship between genes and memes. And he seems to confuse the relationship between genes and memes and a brain and memes. So he seems to think that genes can print memes. And that just does not make any sense. You can't understand psychology through the metaphor of printing, right? The brain is not a printer. It's not a meme copying device. Okay, it's nothing like the complex of proteins that just copies a strand of DNA with very high fidelity. The brain is a thinking device. It's a decision-making device. It generates representations of reality. It explores possibilities. It evaluates them. It makes choices. It does all kinds of things that printers don't do and that the proteins that replicate DNA don't do. So it just doesn't make any sense. This doesn't make any sense. I think that's a sufficient criticism of it, that it's just nonsense. I don't think I should have to try and figure it out. Anyway, I'll move on. The next one is only printer genes are selfish. JF seems to believe that there is a genotype-phenotype distinction within the genotype itself, that the genes for replicating DNA are the masters, and the rest of the genes are the slaves. So the other genes are part of the phenotype of the printer genes. And this is just like some overextension, some ridiculous overextension of the idea of the selfish gene. First of all, the master-slave metaphor does not apply to the genotype-phenotype distinction, and I've already explained that. Printer genes, like, the DNA replicase gene and others, do not reproduce independently of other genes. And you can't replicate DNA without a whole bunch of other stuff. Like, you need an energy metabolism, even just to create the proteins that you're going to need to replicate DNA. So, printer genes do not reproduce independently of other genes or of the phenotype as a whole. All the genes are reproduced together as part of the phenotype. And reproduction depends on the entire phenotype. It doesn't just depend on the printer genes or whatever, right? Reproduction is not just replicating DNA. It's replicating a cell, at the very least. Anyway, so selfishness resides in the phenotype as a whole, not in the genes or in some subset of the genes. JF is extrapolating this idea, I think, from Dawkins' notion of the selfish gene. So I'm going to just briefly talk about the notion of selfishness in biology and the selfish gene concept. In biology, selfish or selfishness just means that a form has been selected to reproduce itself. Okay, so human beings are selfish because the human form has evolved to reproduce the human form. Or in other words, just to reproduce. So that's the way we're selfish. We're selfish reproducers. And this is how you get forms with functions. You have a feedback loop. You have the process of reproduction and selection. And you iterate through that feedback loop over and over and over and over and over again. And you get forms with functions because they've been selected. They've managed to reproduce and reproduce over and over and over again. And so the forms that make it through that process, with lots and lots of mutations occurring over many, many generations, eventually you get forms that are really good at reproducing. They're really selected to be good at reproducing, right? And that's why we call them selfish. It just means that they have been selected to reproduce. So selfishness resides in the unit of reproduction, whatever it is, whatever the reproducing machine is, that's what is selfish. Is a gene a reproducing machine? No, not really. It only reproduces as part of an organism. So, is a gene selfish? No, not really. I'll explain why Dawkins' notion of the selfish gene is a little bit misleading, but also I'll explain what it is and what it isn't in a minute. But the point is that selfishness resides in the unit that reproduces, and the unit that reproduces is the organism, or you could say the phenotype, not the gene. So it's the organism that is selfish. Okay, so let me just briefly go over the selfish gene concept. If I remember it, I read that book years and years ago, like 20 years ago. So I don't remember all the details of it, but I think the notion of the selfish gene was just that genes don't always benefit the organisms in which they occur. And this is especially true for sexually reproducing organisms, because in a sexually reproducing organism, the genes have a little bit of independence, right? You're not reproducing all of the genes as a package. You're only reproducing, basically half of your DNA in every one of your children. Each child inherits half of her DNA from each parent, right? And so that slightly decouples the reproduction of genes from the reproduction of organisms, but only in very limited ways. Okay, so I'll just give an example of where this matters. And Dawkins uses this example. I remember him. I'm pretty sure he does anyway. I seem to remember it. Sickle cell anemia is caused by having two copies of a certain allele of a gene that changes the shape of red blood cells. At least I think that's what it does. Don't quote me, though. And if you have two copies, then you get anemia, and it's bad. You're more likely to die young. But if you only inherit one copy, it doesn't give you anemia, and it protects you from malaria. So one copy good, two copies bad. Okay, so in this example, the gene is selfish, and only in that the gene is selected to exist in the population at some frequency. And it doesn't always benefit the organism in which it occurs, but it is selected for, like if it occurs at a fairly low level, it is selected for because everyone who inherits it usually inherits only one copy, right? If it's at a low frequency. So they benefit from it, but once it starts to get up to a high frequency, then it tends to become deleterious, because then you get, then it's more likely that you're going to get two copies and get the negative effect. Okay, so that's an example. And I think really the book, The Selfish Gene, was really just presenting what you could call new evolutionary theory, which was the synthesis of Darwinian evolutionary theory with game theory. And, this sort of mathematical way of thinking about strategies and things like, the concept of an evolutionary equilibrium or evolutionarily stable strategy, all that stuff. So I think that's really all that was in The Selfish Gene, and that's the notion of selfishness Dawkins was talking about. But I think people often, they take that notion and they take it too far, and because selfishness is a psychological notion, right? It's really, it's something that has to do with your attitude toward others, basically. People take that psychological idea of selfishness and they project onto the gene not just selfishness and not just Dawkins' idea of selfishness, but a kind of agency, a kind of will, a kind of purpose. That a gene has a purpose and a will, and it's pulling the strings on organisms. And there are a couple of mistakes that come from this conception of the gene. One is the idea that genes will somehow arrange it so that organisms do what is good for the gene rather than just doing what is good for the organism. Like, rather than just reproducing themselves, they will act altruistically for the good of the gene. So that's one thing that people try to pull out of the selfish gene. And another thing that they sometimes end up believing is that anything that benefits genes will evolve. That evolution has this teleology that just whatever is good for the gene will evolve. And that's just not true. Anyway, so people have a lot of misconceptions about the idea of the selfish gene and about genes in general, because they tend to anthropomorphize them instead of just thinking about them as information. And that's really all genes are. They're just information that is stored in DNA. All right, let's move on. JF's rejection of memetics. The idea of memetics is that memes, or cultural forms, can propagate from mind to mind. They are selected to reproduce in this way, and they can even be harmful to the reproduction of the people who propagate them. JF rejects the concept of memetics. He seems to believe that memes necessarily serve the interests of genes because they are part of the phenotype of genes and are thus controlled by genes. JF's rejection of memetics is wrong. Just because memes depend on human beings, that doesn't mean that they must serve the reproductive interests of human beings. Parasites depend on hosts, and yet parasites do not serve the reproductive interests of their hosts. A parasitic meme can evolve in the same way that a parasitic tapeworm can evolve. In both cases, the reproduction of the parasite is not linked to the reproduction of the host, and so the phenotype of the parasite can evolve to reproduce itself at the expense of the host. Meanwhile, the host phenotype will evolve to defend itself against the parasite, but there is no guarantee that it will be able to prevent infection. And of course, there are many parasites and diseases that exist in nature. So JF's argument is clearly wrong. Memes can evolve to be parasitic in the same way that life forms can evolve to be parasitic, because in both cases, their reproduction is not linked to the reproduction of the host. Like, memes do not reproduce through the act of human reproduction. They reproduce through acts of communication and imitation that are not linked to human reproduction. And I think you can see in the world today, you can see many examples of parasitic memes. The most obvious of which is the meme of not having kids. Just partying it up, having fun, use birth control. All right. The next one is the relationship between biology and culture. JF's view of the relationship between biology and culture is confused. He says, do DNA queens have access to modifying the queens of human culture? Answer, yes. DNA can produce different brains that will modify the culture they pass on in various ways. Everything in human culture, from single letters to syllables to the entire meaning of a sentence, and even the emotional meaning of an entire story, can be modified by a human brain. Number 2, do the queens of human culture have access to modifying DNA queens? Answer, no. At the moment of writing this book, no human culture on Earth has reached a point where it determines which letters of DNA are to be modified in a human baby. All right, I'm going to ignore the term queen because it's kind of pointless and silly. I'm just going to use the terms gene and meme instead. And it pretty much means the same thing. JF just introduced this term, queen, for unit of inheritance or something like that. All right, so what access do genes have to modifying memes? Well, genes are expressed in the structure of the brain. So genes affect the brain. They have no control over the brain because genes don't do anything. They're just information. They affect the development of the brain. And of course, you have DNA in your brain cells and you're synthesizing proteins in your brain cells all the time from templates that are stored in DNA. But the information of your DNA is fixed at conception, right? And it doesn't change during your lifetime. So DNA doesn't modify memes at all during your lifetime. It doesn't act into culture. It doesn't really act at all. It's just expressed in the structure of your brain. Right? Now, over many generations, you could have an evolution of genes and an evolution of brains. And that could change the culture because different brains could produce a different culture. Okay, so maybe brains get better at abstract reasoning, and then you get more abstract concepts in your culture. And maybe you start using more abstractions in everyday life, like you start using money or laws instead of personal relationships and stuff like that. Okay, so that's an example of how biology can change culture, but the change occurs by the process of evolution changing the brain. Now, of course, the brain can modify human culture more directly, but you have to make a distinction between the brain, which is an organ, which has a whole bunch of complex processes that go on in it, and genes. Basically, culture depends on biology, but through psychology. And culture depends on genes, but for genes to modify culture, they have to evolve. And that takes multiple generations. And the idea of genes printing culture is ridiculous. All right, what access do memes have to modifying genes? Well, culture is essential to human existence and reproduction. We can't really live without culture. We are dependent on culture to exist. Culture can affect genes in the long run by determining the conditions in which we live, and so which biological traits are adaptive. For example, humans have been using fire for at least 1 million years. And the use of fire is a meme. It is a collection of ideas and behavior patterns that we can learn from imitation and communication. The meme of fire has affected our genes and our bodies. Humans could be called fire apes because we are adapted to the use of fire. Our digestive systems are smaller than those of chimps or gorillas. Our teeth and jaws are smaller. We have biologically adapted to eating cooked food. A human cannot live on the diet of a chimp or a gorilla. So, culture affects biology through evolution. Fire is just an example. There are other examples like lactose tolerance and probably language. There was probably a feedback loop between culture and biology, that we started using more complex forms of communication, and the use of those forms of communication created a selective pressure to make us better at using them. So once we started using language, that created a selective pressure to evolve brains that were better at using it, which then made us use it more, which then created an even stronger selective pressure to evolve brains that were better at using it. And so by that feedback loop, culture and biology co-evolved. And that's the relationship between culture and biology. They co-evolve. They evolve together to fit together. And in most ways, they're very, you could say symbiotic or synergistic, or you could say cooperative. They tend to work together. Not always, though. As I've said, parasitic memes can evolve. But most of the time, culture benefits us. And so that's the real relationship between culture and biology. They co-evolve. It's true that memes depend on genes, but it's also true that genes depend on memes. For human beings, there are no genes without memes. There are no brains without culture. Your brain can't survive without culture. Your body can't survive. And also, I mentioned this before, JF seems to confuse the control of the brain over memes with the control of genes over memes. He seems to think that because the brain can generate memes or alter memes or, choose memes or whatever, that genes can do that. But there's a leap there. Genes determine the brain, but genes, are just expressed in the structure of the brain. They don't have any control over anything. They have no choices, right? Like your genes are fixed at conception. Your brain can make choices. Your brain can select one thing versus another. Your brain can change something. It can alter something. it can create something. Genes don't do any of that. And I think the reason why JF makes that confusion is that he probably thinks of genes metaphorically as active entities rather than just information. The brain is active, genes are not active. All right, I'll just briefly mention the phenotypic separation theory of sex. I think I already described it enough before, so maybe I'll just skip over it. It's just the idea that sex evolved to create haploid helper cells, and this doesn't make any sense to me because both mitosis and meiosis destroy the parent cell, so that just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, I don't know, maybe JF can address that. I just discovered that JF apparently did a live stream responding to an audio post that I made on Spreaker that I only put up for Fathom. Somehow JF found it and did a live stream responding to it without even telling me. So that's just like really funny because it's not like my YouTube channel where there's an actual audience. Nobody follows me on Spreaker except maybe 3 people. So it's basically just like a tiny circle of my friends that go there, and it's just a place I put audio for people, and somehow JF found it and he responded to it. It's just kind of funny. All right. Okay, I'm almost done. Thank God. I'm really tired. Okay. The last part is robots will replace us. The terrifying conclusion of all this. All right, so I'll read a passage from the prologue. He says, "What you find on your planet is a robot populace busy exploiting some creatures that bear only the faintest physical resemblance to humans. These unfortunate humanoid creatures live in servility to their mechanical overlords, and though you attempt to provoke them into open revolt against their slave masters, no one listens." In the prologue, JF promises to tell us how life as we know it will come to an end. In the last chapter, he tells a story of how gene editing technology leads to humanity becoming part of a machine's phenotype. This is a new twist on a standard science fiction narrative. The robots take over the world narrative is popular because we find group conflict narratives emotionally compelling and because it is easy to imagine anthropomorphic robots. See, people like group conflict stories. We like war stories. And, we tend to demonize the bad guys in a war anyway, right? So it's kind of convenient to have them be robots because now they're already dehumanized. So it's really easy to imagine the evil robots will take over the world kind of thing. But this is really just silly. It's just never going to happen. Okay? Lots of things are going to happen. Lots of bad things are going to happen in the future. But that's not going to be one of them. At least it's very unlikely. I mean, we might use robot drones or planes or tanks in war, but we're not going to be ruled over by robots that somehow develop a will of their own. This is just never going to happen. There's no evolutionary pathway from technology to... there's no evolutionary pathway to technology that has a will of its own or that is self-replicating. I mean, this is not really entirely related to JF's thing. This is a more general point. But the idea that we're going to create technology that is going to rule over us in the way that humans do, like act like a bunch of humans, this is nonsense. We have already created technology that kind of hijacks our brains. In fact, that happened thousands of years ago. Like, I've used the example before, opiate drugs. They're one of the best technologies for hijacking your brain. Other technologies that kind of hijack us are birth control pills, smartphones, So there are lots of technologies that are sort of, well, you could say parasitic or maybe exploitative or just harmful. But yeah, the evil robots are going to take over the world thing, this is just silly. This is us projecting conflict with other human beings onto robots because it's easy to imagine. But it's not going to happen in real life. Okay, so in JF's version of the story, it's the takeover of the gene printers. We start using gene printer technology, like gene editing technology, to create designer babies. And this becomes super common, and then eventually, in a very contrived storyline, we end up creating self-replicating life, let's call them life forms that consist of this technology, plus our genes, plus us, I guess. And so we sort of get incorporated into the machine, and we become part of the phenotype of these, these machines, I guess. Okay, so, the story, I guess, would be sort of interesting to explore, but not the way JF tells it. It just isn't that interesting the way he tells it. Actually, I just want to mention, it's kind of ironic that he rejects memetics, but then he tells a story in which it's actually the memes that end up determining the genes. Like, in a way, it's that the idea of having perfect children takes over the minds of people, and it's that idea that, really ends up becoming the determining factor, let's say, the thing that determines the genome. Memes end up controlling the genome because it's our ideas about what would be good in our children. Those ideas end up determining the genome. And that is an interesting thought experiment. There are a lot of interesting thought experiments that you could do that involve this kind of technology. But this story, it just isn't very good. Okay, and it doesn't prove anything, it doesn't demonstrate anything, because it's not a thought experiment in which you lay out the premises and then you reason to a logical or probable conclusion from the premises. It's a story in which JF just makes it up as he goes along. He just asserts this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. He doesn't derive the consequences from the initial premises. So it's not a very interesting story. Now, it is interesting to ask, what would happen if we started using gene editing technology to select the genes of our children? Maybe I'll write something on that later. Maybe I'll do a video on that. That's an interesting question. I can just say a few things about it now, but I want to get this over with. Basically, there are three possibilities. One is that it's used by the state to control the population, to create a compliant, obedient population that just, does what it's supposed to do. And in that case, we become like domesticated animals, or we become even more like domesticated animals. So that's possibility number one. Possibility number two, if it's more libertarian, if like it's everyone choosing their children's genes, then it could become a tragedy of the commons, a runaway status signaling competition in which everyone wants to have perfect babies, so everyone ends up being beautiful and super smart, but then there's nobody to take out the garbage and flip the burgers, and we end up with a population of that meets our aesthetic ideals and our notions of what is good, but would not actually be a functional population for a society, because a society needs a mix of different kinds of people. So you might end up with really tall guys, and all the girls would be perfectly formed and have big boobs and everything. And that's just like that's a tragedy of the commons situation. It's a runaway competition in which nobody wins, but the bar is raised. So everybody gets more beautiful, but we're still competing, and doesn't really accomplish anything. So that's the second possibility. The third possibility is that we collectively develop a good set of rules for managing how we use the technology, and we use it in a way that benefits both individuals and society. So it is possible for us to come up with a way of using this technology that is beneficial. I don't think we should try. I'm not a big fan of this kind of eugenics. I believe in empirical eugenics, where you have to meet certain criteria in order to reproduce. I think that would be a better way of doing eugenics. But I do think it would be possible to use gene editing technology carefully and wisely. I'm not saying that that's very likely for human beings to do that, but it is a possibility. There's no natural law which says that if we started using gene editing technology, it would, become another life form or something, right? And this just does not follow. Anyway. And we might eventually, if we did start using technology like that, we could eventually become as dependent on it as we are dependent on fire, or on, cooking our food. But still, that wouldn't make it a new form of life. Any more than fire is a new form of life. They would just be another technology that we depend on. So yeah, we could become so adapted to it culturally and biologically that we became dependent on it. But that still wouldn't make it another form of life. All right, anyway, I think I'll just end it there. And if you enjoyed this, then instead of buying JF's book, which is terrible, you shouldn't buy it, don't waste your money, you should buy my ebook, which I think is $3 or something like that. It's not very expensive. I don't know what it is. I put it up there about a year ago. Anyway, there's a link to it in the article, and if I remember, I will put a link in the description of this video. And as always, thanks for listening if you made it this far without falling asleep. Either way, good night.